Good day, everyone. Yeah, we're still on it. Practical approach to combating cyber crimes. My name is Tina Tuzuebu, and this is about the fourth in the series. And like I said, this is my own way of commemorating the Cybersecurity Awareness Month and concluding it as everybody's take-home package. We really need to understand how to combat and what is expected of us in combating cybercrime. And we need to do that deliberately in various ways. And for us to achieve that, we need to, imbibe the culture. Let the culture just be inculcated into our daily routine, into our daily practices. The same way you build your personal hygiene, that's the same way it should apply, when it comes to your critical information assets. Okay, in the previous series, we looked at how we can protect our information assets. We've looked at identifying the information assets, now how we can protect them, leveraging on the concept of multi-layered security. Now we are looking at determining the ideal security measure. You've identified, you've classified, you now have to determine, and you now understand, what protecting your information assets is all about, the controls around it. You don't just wake up and start applying controls or security measure. You understand each control, each line of control, what is expected of that line of control. We talked about the various control types and then the various measures. Those are the tools we apply, preventive tools. They come in form of, encryption, password tools, application filtering tools, intrusion detection tools, log monitoring tools, and all that. So now, how do we, determine the ideal security measure? You know, on understanding and establishing a good knowledge of the controls, you know, then what should apply? How do I go about it? How do I protect my critical information access should come next. So the measures of control could only be ascertained, when we understand the vulnerabilities around each of the assets, and then from the vulnerabilities we understand the threats around it. What are the threats around a particular weak point, a particular vulnerability, and then from there we understand the measure of risk, the probability of risk around those assets, and then apply the risk controls, analyze the risks, and then apply the ideal risk treatment. So we're going to discuss the concept of vulnerabilities, threats, and risks, that must extensively apply, for you to determine the ideal security measure, around your information assets. So the entire concept of risk management will apply. And the most important thing here is that the cost of each security measure, we must apply. The cost of how much you employ each security measure is important, because we don't need to, apply to the level that we now, bite our finger. You have to apply to align with business objectives. You have to apply to add value and to help the business to keep making profits. So when you're applying, you have to be very, very cautious and understand, leverage on mathematics and a lot of, criteria to understand the ideal security measure to apply at any point in time. Yeah, we will do a little mathematics here, but it's not much of it though. So what is vulnerability? We're going to discuss the concept of vulnerability, threats, and risks extensively, and then impacts. Vulnerability is more like a weakness or a loose hold, a loose end, a loophole or a loose end, is like, for example, when we say that, oh, your system is vulnerable because you're not leveraging on strong password culture. Now, that what that means is that anybody can guess your password. because your system is running at a loose end, and then you're always using the same password, the same password, the same password. Yeah, because your system is at a loose end. You can say your system is vulnerable, and any of the bad guys could have his or her way, around your platform, whether you like it or not, you know, because it is vulnerable. So an asset or any object could be seen as vulnerable if there is an element of weakness around that asset. The weakness could be in form of, opening, an opening, For example, you have your fence, and your fence, an arm of your fence is destroyed or punctured, like a hole or a block removed from your fence, your wall, that is a loose end. The bad guys could easily penetrate or come through. And that is how you have loose ends across the systems, across ranging from your hardware up to your data, your systems, your operating system, your application, your data, even your files. All these things are in layers. You have the infrastructure layers, the layer, you have the host layer, that's the platform layer where you have the operating system, and then you have your data layer, and then you have your files, your documents, and all that. So we need to, and the vulnerabilities around each of them is overwhelming, and we need to look at each of them critically. So let's assume that we have a weakness around your system, even configuration. When you don't have the right configuration around your system, it could be a loose end that the bad guys could leverage on. And then anytime you have default settings, you leverage on the default password that your system came with, apparently your Wi-Fi or your any of your gadgets, So that could also be a vulnerability that could grant access to the bad guys. So there is an element of visible and invisible vulnerabilities surrounding especially every new device, every evolvement or adoption of technology goes with vulnerability. You know, there is an element. You cannot assume that, oh, your systems are completely 100% free of vulnerabilities. No, not even when you apply the controls. So, shey you understand what I'm saying? Not even when you apply multi-layered control measures, there will always be risks, residual risks, there will always be element of, tolerable vulnerabilities. Okay, so we can also eliminate them, but the risks, you can't eliminate the risks 100%. There will always be element of risks and stress around your assets. But what we are looking at here is acceptable level of control, such kind of control that after applying it, you feel good, you feel comfortable, even when the bad guys try, they will knock at the door, knock at the door. Even the residual risks remaining will not allow them to have their way. So that's the kind of as level of acceptable control that we are looking at. Okay, now it is a good practice to go the proactive way, to proactively outline the vulnerabilities. That is what we are doing now. Proactive risk assessment, proactively outline the vulnerabilities around each of your assets. If you are deploying a new application, that's the first thing to do, while you are doing your information gathering, at that first stage, definition stage, you try to outline, all the risks around that asset. You know, if you are buying a new asset, buying a new mobile phone, you outlined all the risks around it, all the vulnerabilities around it, and then you now have to you leverage on risk analysis to confirm whether they are critical or they are at high risk, medium risk, or low risk. So your risk management process is always good to leverage on a risk management framework. Most people are so used to, this their what do you call it now? Brainstorming. What do you call it? Brainstorm, as in leveraging on objective way of, working around your risks, calculating your risks and what have you. So a critical server operating system with no antivirus, no updated patches, weak login password, easily accessible unauthorized parties, they can already be easily accessible. You don't have any uninterrupted power supply plan, no backup plan at all. That is vulnerable. You can say that, oh, that particular operating system, in fact, the IT data center is vulnerable. Now, what do we understand by threats? You can understand that vulnerability has to do with a weak point, a loose hole, a loophole, or a loose end. Now, what do we understand by threats? Threats has to do with that point at which, it looks like the vulnerability, the opening, the weakness around your system, that weak password, is now at that point at which, you are already seeing it as dangerous. The bad guys are already seeing it as an opportunity, for them to leverage on. That point at which you are scared that, oh, this particular weekend could be taken advantage of. The bad guys could exploit the weakness and then leverage on that to log onto your system, or to guess your password and log onto your system and make away with important information. So at that point, that's the point at which that danger, the danger, the worry, the fear that these bad guys, which are, we call them hackers, we call them criminals, attackers, threat agents, they are points at which, that it looks like, oh, this vulnerability is going to be exploited by the bad guys. That is the threat, you know. So you cannot talk about vulnerability without talking about threats. And then this vulnerability and threat now is now the probability of the threat occurring is now where the risk comes in. You know, if the probability of the threat occurring is high, then that is, seen as risk. You cannot say that the risk is high. So some of the critical operating system vulnerabilities outlined in the previous slide could so much harm, as in could cause so much harm, on both the assets and the business if they are exploited by the bad guys. You know, like the hole I was talking about, the same hole applies on the systems. Sometimes it could be on your application, backdoors into your application. So the bad guys could penetrate, log onto your platform through that backdoor and then tamper with things, take advantage of your resources, and then tamper with your documents. So the bad guys, which is as in known as the threat agents, the hackers, could take advantage of the fact that there is no antivirus program on the system and then, you know, get the system infected. So and then if you have virus in your system could be very, very disastrous, and negatively affect your system so terribly. So the point at which you're getting worried that, oh, these whatever, these bad guys could exploit the vulnerability and then make away with, things and cause a huge damage to your system and to your organization is what is known as threats. We've talked about vulnerability, we've talked about threats, and now risk. Risk is how the probability. I need you to be understanding this because we're coming to the aspect of mathematics, and the mathematics is not too much. It's not much. You really need to understand the concepts, before we dive deep. Okay. The risk is the probability or likelihood that a vulnerability could be exploited with a threat by a threat agent. That probability or likelihood that, oh, this threat is actually will actually apply. This threat, could be real, could be actualized by the threat agent. If we don't do anything about it, the probability or the likelihood, you now start checking, is it possible? Will it apply? out in what situation, in what condition could it trigger, you know. So that is risk, the probability or the likelihood that it's likelihood of occurrence. So following our critical operating system example, one of the vulnerabilities is that of weak password, weak login password, which could be easily guessed and attacked. That is the risk, you know. As in the attack getting at that you are scared of it being attacked is the threat. And then the risk is that, oh, this threat has actually been overtaken, or this threat could be overtaken at the end of the day. And then if it could be overtaken, then what's the probability that it will actually apply? Okay, so the probability that the weak login password could be exploited with guessing attacks, that is a threat, by the threat agent, is referred to as risk. So it is this level of certainty or probability that now determines whether the risk is high, you know. It is the probability of risk, the probability of that risk occurring that now makes it, categorizes whether it is at the high level or low level, or it is actually a medium level, you know. If it's not low, it is seen as, if it's low, it is seen as insignificant. Now, if the risk is high, then we are employing a security measure, which at this point is referred to as countermeasure. I call them security measures though, Some people call them safeguards, some call them countermeasures. But when it comes to risk scenario, they call it risk treatment or risk response. That's your own way of responding to the risk. If the risk is high, you respond to it. If it's low, you respond to it. And if it's medium, you respond to it. So the various ways now the various responses, could be the decisive factor. So as we discussed in the previous series, that vulnerability, like that of password, now falls under technical control, you know, and that could be, a breach, against our objective. Remember, our objective is to achieve a level of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So the security measure will now be a preventive technical control. In most cases, the security measure could be preventive administrative control. It could be preventive physical control. It depends on the line of risk. If the risk is attributed to physical control, you apply. If it's attributed to system, you apply. Most times it is holistic. A particular threat will entail physical control, will entail a measure of administrative control, and a measure of technical control for it to, be applied with holistic approach. So the security measure will be so we'll now be looking at the risk equation. I will talk about the risk equation before I talk about the various ways of responding to risks. So risk equation, the general risk equation, because all these accountants, they keep coming up with various risk equations. But in this our scenario, the general risk equation is vulnerability times threat times the impact. The impact there is like the consequence. If actually this threat occurs, what is the impact, the consequence of the threat, exploiting the vulnerability? What will be the consequence? Is it going to pull down the company completely, or is the company going to lose so much, or is the reputation or image of the company going to be affected? So you need to critically look at it. So the risk equation would assist us to understand the risk level, of a threat exploiting a vulnerability on a particular asset. So we look at it critically, like a missing patch is a vulnerability, and then the missing patch, the vulnerability of missing patch, destroying the systems, collapsing an application is threat. And then the consequence around it, the gravity of the issue is now the impact. So the risk equation will assist us to determine the risk response, and that is where we'll go in. And we have four different risk responses. When you are certain that the probability of this particular risk occurring is high, then you go with either accepting the risk. Accepting the risk is saying, oh, the risk, sorry, if it's high, based on some conditions and criteria, you look for how to reduce the risk. That is actually the first line of risk response. You try to reduce the risk or mitigate the risk. Like I said, you cannot eliminate risk, but you can reduce it and you can mitigate it. So that is the first line of action. You look for how to mitigate the risk, you know. And then if the risk is too low, and you can tolerate it, if it's too insignificant and you don't really have what it takes to start treating it or employing controls, because it's insignificant to the business. So you go with accepting the risk, you know, you accept it. Now, we have four risk responses. It's either you mitigate or reduce it, or you accept it. So is it you mitigate, accept, based on the criteria, based on the situation on ground, based on the consequence or the impact level. Then you avoid. Avoidance, the risk avoidance is like saying, don't go this line, my business can do without going this line at all. Let's just avoid this line of risk. For example, your like this particular hole I talked about, or let's say a legacy application that nobody accesses it and is on read only mechanism, and then someone is saying, oh, you must buy another level of maybe data loss prevention tool, you know data loss prevention tool, or let's say, I don't I'm trying to do a check on what, you don't use it often and the data is always there, the backup is always there. Yeah, in as much as it's important, you don't need to apply as much control, as more control as the one that is live and accessible by all parties, accessible by customers, accessible by users. This one is already controlled. So what I'm trying to say in essence is that, you know, sometimes, when you look at the assets that is involved and you consider the fact that, oh, this asset doesn't even apply to our bottom line, it doesn't apply to the corporate image of the organization or to regulatory body regulations. So we can decide to avoid it completely. It doesn't make too much sense to us. So you avoid that line of business, that particular aspect of business that could, create the risk. You avoid it completely. So you can decide. The fourth one there is when it has to do with something you cannot cope with. The organization cannot cope with a collapsed building. Like you have your company collapsed because of earthquake or because of hurricane, like people in Florida. We are talking about Hurricane Helene, and the other one. So it's like you cannot do without it. So if there is a collapse of building, what proactive measure are you putting in place, to transfer the liability to a third party? That's where insurance comes in. And we call it, you are transferring it to a third party, you are transferring the risk to a third party, you are transferring the risk to your escrow, your software key escrow, or your key management escrow, or your source code escrow. That's the third party that is managing your keys, managing your source codes, you transfer it to them instead of you bearing the risk. So in risk response, we look at four things, mitigation of the risk, accepting the risk as it is and continuing your business because it's low, and then avoiding that line of business instead of spending so much, and then you spend so much and you're not even getting much from the business, you avoid it completely, or you transfer the business, you transfer the liability, or the risk, you know, you transfer the risk to a third party, for example, insurance company or your software escrow. So it's the insurance company now that will bear the cost of the collapse of your business, your building, and they will take care of every bit. But then they also have their own gain, because at the end of the day, most of these risks, like earthquake, they don't occur most times. They rarely occur, but yet you have to be paying money. you know you have to be transferring the risk to them with huge amount of money. So when your building collapses, you will relax. It will now be their own headache. But then most times it's not really their headache. Most times it's their gain. But that does not mean that you should not transfer major risk to third parties. Okay, I've explained what do you call it? Yeah, they mitigate, what it means to mitigate, what it means to accept, then avoid and transference of your risk. Then the various risk analyzing types, you can decide to leverage on two major methods to analyze risk. Some people could leverage on quantitative risk analysis. I actually like quantitative risk analysis because it is mathematics is involved. Then others, could go with qualitative risk analysis because those ones are more objective. For example, DeFi technique, DeFi technique where people will go with, do you think this is a high risk? And everybody will say yes. Or do you think this is low risk? People will say, oh no, it's not risk. So the multitude or whoever, when you are the majority will now take the vote, based on criteria, political criteria, objective reasoning. So you say that qualitative risk analysis is actually objective inclined. Sorry about this, is a mix up here. It is objective in nature, while the quantitative risk analysis is subjective in nature. Quantitative risk analysis is subject to the parameters, the variables that you put in. For example, we have a quantitative risk analysis looking at monetary values, and taking into consideration asset value. You have to get the asset value, including the cost of the asset, the man hour, the cost of labor. And then you have to get the exposure factor of the assets. What is the level of exposure of the asset? Based on the level of exposure, that is where the vulnerability is embedded. So that level of exposure will determine whether, oh, this guy is a valuable, sorry, the risk around it will be high or not. So you now talk about the single loss expectancy. That is the value of loss expected on an event when there is an incident around that asset. What is this loss expected around it? So the loss expected around it will now be calculated as a value of the asset multiplied with the exposure factor. Exposure factor is saying, what at what level do you think, oh, this risk could occur? Like, let me give you an example. I have my system here, and I don't have antivirus inside my system. And this my system is like 50,000 naira, and I don't have antivirus inside it. And the value is 50,000. The asset value and the man hour every bit, 50,000. 50,000 is insignificant, but this is just an example. Then the exposure factor, that, oh, because I don't have antivirus, because the password is a weak password, the exposure factor that, oh, this guy will be could be exploited. The exposure factor could be, what do you call it? It could be 1%, it could be 2%, it could be 3%, it could be 4%. And then I will now like the single loss expectancy, the value of loss that you can anticipate from each of the assets when they are when it's overtaken with the vulnerability, or when the vulnerability is exploited, you can now multiply the value of the assets by the exposure factor. You know, I told you that it will be little mass, but not much. This is not much. Then we now have, so to get the single loss expectancy for one event is value of asset multiplied by exposure factor. And then the annual rate of occurrence for one event, you know, that's the frequency at which the disruption could occur in 1 year. So if the disruption could occur in once every year, so you can say 1/12. If the destruction can occur 10 times every year, you can say 10/12, you know, like 10 divided by the 12 months in a year. So, and then the annual expectancy, sorry, if the frequency, you know, at which the destruction would occur is once in a year, so you say that the annual rate of occurrence is 1, you know, because it's occurring once in a year. If it's occurring twice, you say it's 2, you know. And sometimes, you know, the occurrence is like if the occurrence is a particular time, you know, it depends on the number of occurrence, you divide it by 1. Yeah, you divide it by 1 because it's 1 year. You divide by 1 year to get the actual rate of occurrence. So the annual loss expectancy will now be the value of loss expected in 1 year, you know, and that loss will now be the single, whatever you get from the single loss expectancy multiplied by the annual rate of occurrence, you know. And then, you know, remember the exposure factor could be in percentage, you know, you divide it by 100. So the quality risk analysis is actually a process where you calculate the risk using determined scenarios, you know. That is objective in nature. So now, what makes the quantitative risk analysis subjective is because all the variables, most of them, you know, you have to supply them. Most of them are not real, you know, are not the actual, because you're calculating asset value, calculating man hour, you know, calculating cost of labor and every bit of it. And then you're getting the exposure factor, you're getting this single loss expectancy. So it's actually subjective, subject to what information you feed in. So you really need to do your mathematics very well to ensure that you're working with the right variables, you know, so that you get the at least expected results. But this one is depends on opinion of stakeholders, you know. If the stakeholders or the business owners or the asset owners, if they say this is high, then it is high based on their experience and based on the fact that, oh, I'm the owner of the thing and I know the value I'm getting from it, and you know, based on that. So you always make sure that the cost of applying control, or the cost of treating your risk, you know, is not more than the value of the assets, you know. The cost of your countermeasure or your risk treatment must not be more than the cost of the value of your assets. It is important. When it is more than, when your countermeasure is more than the value of asset, you go for a compensating control, you know. That's when compensating control comes in. You try to, you know, use this control, another cheap control that can still do the job, you know, to bring it in. Even if it's not going to do the job 100%, but at least it could minimize the risk to an acceptable level. So after you arrive at a countermeasure using the risk equation and risk analysis, it is a good practice to evaluate the cost of countermeasure and asserting that it is not more than the value of the assets. Now, do you want us to do the mathematics? Now, the cost of, okay, let me conclude here. Now, the cost of the countermeasure, you know, is always you leverage on the annual loss expectancy. Yeah, you leverage on the annual loss expectancy to understand, at what point the cost of your countermeasure is more than the cost of, the value of the assets. So, and to achieve that, you leverage on the equation I have here. This one now is for technical guys, yeah, risk professionals. Yeah, I admit. So you try to leverage on this equation, annual loss expectancy before the countermeasure. Before you apply countermeasure, what was the expected annual loss expectancy? As in, what the figure that we got from here, annual loss expectancy. Annual loss expectancy is got from single loss expectancy multiplying annual rate of occurrence. And then the annual loss expectancy here before countermeasure minusing annual loss expectancy after countermeasure, and then the result you get from it by the time you minus it from annual cost of countermeasure, you know that's when you now understand the cost of the countermeasure, around one event. And then if the cost is more than the cost of the value of the asset, then you go for a compensating control. And you leverage on risk management frameworks to achieve this. We have quite a lot of them. We have risk. As at the time I drafted this, that was in 2017. Now we have ISO 31000 on risk management. We have NIST risk management framework 37, and we have risk management guideline 30. That's NIST 837, NIST 830. Then you have the Octave and other risk management frameworks that you can leverage on. Even most of the architectural framework like COBIT, you can also leverage on COBIT, to achieve certain things. So most of the risk management frameworks must apply accordingly. Like I said, the exposure factor is measured in percentage. If my asset value is 50,000 naira, then I'm not saying the exposure factor is 10%. That would be like 10 over 100 times 50,000 naira. That is my exposure factor. So you try to get your single point loss expectancy from there. Your single loss expectancy now becomes 50,000 naira times the exposure factor, which is 10%, and that 10% is 10 over 100. So it's in percentage, and annual rate of occurrence is just a number, but you have to divide it by 1 because it's calculated on yearly basis. So you can calculate annual rate of occurrence in 1 year, and then annual loss expectancy will now be single loss expectancy multiplying the annual rate of occurrence. So you can go back to review your risk analysis. Is important, and you really need to understand this risk analysis. This is what the area most organizations are ignoring and avoiding. That is why they cannot, commensurate what the controls they are implementing. Their budget around security controls, they cannot tie it to values. They cannot tie it to value propositions. Every organization should have a value propositions around their assets, around their security controls. Let there be value at appropriate cost benefit analysis, that comes with a business case that confirms that, oh, this is the value we are going to get when we deploy a particular security control. So important facts that you need to know on risk management before we close this session, is the responsibility of the business units or group managers, even though it has to be in support of the top level management. So when we talk about risk, ascertaining the ideal security measure, it is the baby of the asset owners, and most of the asset owners are the business members of the business units, like your head of operations, head of finance, head of marketing. They know what they need, and they know how to get it, and they know the risks around them, around those assets. And then Risk management focuses on reducing risk to an acceptable level. Like I have always said, you cannot eliminate risk completely. You reduce and mitigate it to an acceptable level. You know, a level accepted by the business and with the right mechanisms to maintain that level. You need those mechanisms to maintain the level. Now, risk management will help to ascertain the most cost-effective, relevant, up-to-date, ideal, and resilient countermeasure. Yeah, based on your analysis from the risk management, based on your finding from the risk management, you now have to ascertain what is the ideal security control, what is the ideal tool to apply. You don't just apply to because, oh, this particular bank, this is the control they apply. Oh no. You apply your control based on the findings, your risk findings from your risk analysis, findings from your business impact analysis, findings from your gap analysis. It is very important. So the right countermeasure will eliminate the vulnerability. Yeah, it could wipe off the vulnerability because let's assume we are dealing with weak password. The right countermeasure is to apply enforce a password control mechanism, and to make sure everyone obliges. So that can eliminate that weak password vulnerability, but it cannot eliminate the risk 100%. No, it can't eliminate the entire risk. So you always have a residual risk, you know. And residual risk is that risk that is left, after you've applied all your control measures, and your layered security controls. That's called residual risk. And residual risk is actually acceptable. It has the business members of the business unit must endorse it that it is a acceptable risk, by the business. It is acceptable and they can go wrong with it. And that is it. And then, the assets will be protected by reducing or mitigating risks and preventing the threat agents from exploiting vulnerabilities around the assets. So the risk treatment is actually the controls that you are applying on your information assets. I know this particular aspect is quite technical and I understand. Then you need to go back to it, review it. It's simple, like risk. Analyzing risk is very, very simple. But what makes it subject is the variables you are supplying, the numbers you are supplying. Are you sure you are getting the right values, the right monetary values, the right exposure factors and all that? you know that's what makes it subjective. But the other type, everybody's brainstorming and saying, oh, based on what applies in my business processes, this risk is high, this is high, or what. So it depends on you, whichever one you choose to take and apply. I personally will prefer the quantitative analysis if I have the right variables for it. So this where we will end the ascertaining the ideal security measure. To ascertain the ideal security measure, you really have to run your risk analysis and be sure that, oh, this is the kind of risk treatment that is required here. And your risk treatment could be to mitigate the risk or accept it as it is if it is good to go or if it is low, or you avoid it completely if it's that complicating and you don't need too much of stress. You avoid it or you transfer it to a third party if it is the type that you can't afford to handle or to manage. It's so gravy, like collapse of your entire building. So you transfer it to the third party. It could be collapse of your data center, your entire data center, collapse of your critical operating system, critical server. So you transfer to third party insurance. And that's where we end in this session. So our next session now, we've understood every bit of this. The next session now is on those attacks, how we can combat them, and then how we can prefer solution. So see you in the next session. Thank you. Please remember to share this. You'll be doing me a huge favor sharing. Thank you and cheers.